We've come to the very last presentation of the day. I know it's been a long day, been a very productive day, lots of information, and we saved for last kind of a show and tell, and that's going to involve Dr. Paul Williamson from the University of Montana and Dr. Brian Kearns, or at least Chief Engineer Brian Kearns. And you know, earlier in the day when Professor Running was talking about climate change, he had a picture of the Biomax gasification plant that he said we're going to probably see a lot of these in the future. And so we have the good opportunity of having a demonstration of that today. The unit is out in the parking lot, and Dr. Williamson and Brian are going to talk about the technology and then take us outside and take a look at this apparatus. And so that's an exciting opportunity here for late in the day.
And then I filter the gas in this baghouse filter system right here, black box. At that point, the gas is good to go into the engine. It's just a standard Chevy V6 engine. Well, not standard. The Chevy V6 engine has been modified to run on this wood gas. It can run on propane, gasoline, and wood gas. Every so often, I've got to shake that gasifier to conduct all the char, the spent char, down through the system. That's what you just heard, the vibrator going off every 90 seconds. Also sort the chips, that's what's going on over here. It's all automatic, of course. It knows how much wood's in the air. When it gets down below a certain level, it turns this on, says I need more wood. It brings it up through the air. I can only use a certain size of wood. It's too big, it gums up my gasifier. If it's too small, it's useless. So I sort it there. So the wood drops out of the bins, goes through a little shaker that sorts it, and it's conducted up the auger into the top of the gasifier. Using slash, chips, needles, bark, twigs, that kind of material. Then at the end, I use 50 pounds an hour. This is what comes out after 1 hour. 50 pounds is reduced to this biochar. And SOS, Sustainable Obtainable System Solutions. Gloria Flora was giving a presentation earlier. She takes this and plows it back into soil, uses it as a soil amendment.
The energy source to get it, what are you using for an energy source to get it started and run it?
To get it started, I have propane. I bring it up to the temperature of propane. And then once it's at temperature, I switch it over to fuel gas or to wood gas, and then it's self-sustaining.
How much of that, what percent of that is using this to run?
I'm sorry? Oh, I make about 25 kilowatts, and of that I use about, it depends what's operating at the moment. I use between 2 and 3 kilowatts for onboard systems. I'm sorry? It's very fine particulate. Some of it's PM 2.5 and lower. So you have to be careful about application.
What were the modifications you needed to do to the engine?
Basically, you just add a 3-way valve to take in propane, gasoline, and/or fuel or wood gas, and then add combustion air valve, and then computer controls on those valves. You want to load the generators on the other side. We can walk over there. I have it closed right now because it's in that fire lane there. But if you want to open it up, we'll take a look at that. the assembly line, put it right in here, using a Chevy V6 engine. That's running a generator. This is configured for a 480 volt, 3-phase AC. Also have a transformer on board so I can do 120 AC, normal home power. In fact, this weekend we'll be powering the soundstage for a festival down at Kaiserski Park called Local Fest. Any questions? You know, pellets can work, but I need a certain surface area of char in order to conduct the chemistry as it goes down, as the smoke goes down through the bed. The pellets burn to a very small char particle, and so you can use them, but it's better for chips, better with chips. So the company that had made this is called Community Power Corporation out of Williamson, Colorado. They've been playing around with these gasifiers for about 15 years. They make a stationary model. Those examples I showed you in my presentation, basically this thing right here. This little skid. When I went to them, I said, I want a portable one. That took me into a whole different realm of engineering and design to get the weights and balances appropriate. And one of the things I found that's the nerve center. That's the computer, all the control, the feeding in there, all the monitoring system. Every once in a while a big chunk of wood gets underneath that auger and screeches like heck. So one of the things that we're going to do better next time is better ruggedization. So when this thing's traveling, think what happens when one of those little things come loose. Sometimes they don't even pop loose, they're just in there, but they're not making contact. You gotta have really good troubleshooting skills to find out where that sucker is and get it fixed. Every time I take it somewhere, I always find a handful of bolts and nuts from who knows where. So we can always make things better, and we'll try to do that next go around.
I want to introduce Brian Spangler, the Montana Department of Environmental Quality Business and Community Assistance Program Manager. And Brian worked closely with, our office worked closely with DEQ and DNRC to put this workshop together. But Brian's going to do a little bit of a recap of yesterday's activities and then tell us about today's agenda. And then after that, we'll get started with our first panel. So, Brian.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to see everybody back here today. I think we had a very productive day yesterday. Before I get started today, I want to take an opportunity to personally thank Angela Farr for her coordination for putting this workshop together. She went beyond the call of duty with the planning committee and coordinated a lot of that work that we did and got everybody here. So if you take a few seconds here to thank Angela. After we're done today, there's going to be a tour over to the Roseburg facility here. It's just down the street, maybe a half a mile or so. We'll actually have the University of Montana biodiesel bus here. So we'll be doing some marketing as we ride the bus over to tour that facility. Summary of yesterday, we were very fortunate to get 5 state agency directors in one location and have them provide an overview of what their thoughts are and how we can move this forward in the state. Also, yesterday was a great opportunity to hear about the Western Governors Association biomass utilization study they did with input from the Forest Service. And then Steve Running from the University of Montana and climate change, how that's affecting the forest in Montana and our everyday lives. Then we had the biomass overview where our forests are overstocked and beetle kill, and some points on that. And then how to aggregation and collection technology, how to get that out of the forest, and then on the conversion technology. And then we talked about forest access and timber availability. And then at the end of the day, we had an overview of the federal programs from USDA and the Department of Energy. And then at the end of the day, we summed it up with one of those technologies and went out for the tour for the Biomax that's operated by the University of Montana College of Technology here in Missoula. Today, we're going to start out this morning with industry perspective on biomass and the workforce for the future in Montana. And at lunch today, we're going to have the EPA in from Washington, D.C. to talk about the renewable fuels standard. Then we're going to go into breakout sessions, and we'll talk about how do we encourage the development of bioenergy in the state of Montana, the delivery systems, and supply opportunities and workforce opportunities and challenges. So it'll wrap it up with, we take those recommendations from the breakout section or sessions and draft up a short memo to the governor how we take the next steps and move forward. So without further ado, we'll start with our first panel this morning, and that's going to be on industry perspective on effective policy, and that's going to be, the moderator will be Tom Kaiserski. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. If our panelists on industry perspectives would like to come on up, we'll get started this morning. We have a great panel, four speakers on today's panel. And you know, energy development, any kind of development, economic development is going to require effective policies, state policies to help move things forward. And you know, Montana has worked hard to cultivate a business-friendly environment, and I think sometimes that's maybe an aspect of Montana that we need to focus on more, because Montana really does have a business-friendly climate. I think it was in 2007 that Forbes magazine rated Montana as the #1 site location in the United States. So that was just a couple of years ago. We have one of the, I think we're the 6th lowest tax structure for business in the U.S. So we do have a business-friendly climate, and we're working hard to continue to develop that. And to discuss industry perspectives on doing business in Montana, we do have 4 great panelists: Cliff Bradley, Bill Carlson, Mel Murphy, and David Naccarato. And they're going to talk to us on the projects that they're working on, what they found to be some of the aspects of Montana's perspectives and policies on energy development that are helpful, and also some best practices from other states and their experience. So I think we're going to have a lot to learn this morning in this session. And so looking forward to it. Our first speaker is Cliff Bradley with the Montana Microbial Products, founding partner. I've known Cliff for 4 years. He's really a leading individual in the state of Montana when it comes to bioenergy. Montana Microbial Products develops and markets applied microbiology solutions for agriculture and bioprocess industries. And Cliff's been at this for a long time, 25 years, and is working on active projects across the state, and will have much to tell us. So everybody could welcome Dr. Cliff Bradley.
That water there and not spill it? No, I gotta put that water right there and not spill it. Oh, there we go. Well, thank you all for coming this morning, and I'm going to talk about something. Yesterday we spent most of the day on wood, so this morning I'm going to start out with something completely different, and we're going to talk about things other than wood. Going to talk a bit about the perspectives of a small business that's been trying to work in the field of ethanol for a long time. I think we had our first DOE grant, a different named company, but our first grant from the Department of Energy to work on cellulosic ethanol that was before they called it cellulosic ethanol, and that was in 1984, I think. So we've been at this for 25 years. So we've been following federal policy, and I'm going to talk about some of that to begin with here, for 25 years. And before that, did some work with the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation in Montana here with Howard Haynes, and did some work on starch conversion in barley. So we've been at this a long time and have seen the really consistent policy from the federal level, USDA and DOE in particular, have been for a very small number of very large feedstock volumes, and all geared toward very large-scale projects. And that's been a consistent thing for the last 25 years. And the other consistent thing for the last 25 years is nobody's actually built one yet. That the first large-scale cellulose ethanol plants are just now going up, and they're completely government financed. There has been no private capital to finance an cellulose ethanol plant in the last 25 years. So that's the first perspective, and that hasn't really changed much. In the last couple years, Montana Microbial is working with another company on our own or with another larger company, have submitted or tried to deal with a couple very large-scale projects submitted with the DOE solicitations, and they start out with this criteria. You got to be working on a high-impact feedstock. 100 million tons of something is the minimum feedstock. Well, if you're anywhere west of the Rocky Mountains, that pretty much leaves out, or in the Rocky Mountains, that pretty much leaves out anything other than wood. There isn't 100 million tons of anything else, possible exception of straw, and we'll talk about that. And it's all geared toward large-scale biorefineries. Yesterday we heard that the minimum commercial scale DOE thinks about is 800,000 dry tons of feedstock a year. We've looked at this back of the envelope. If you actually were going to build a 100 million gallon a year cellulose ethanol plant in Montana from dryland straw, you'd need to draw straw from 4,000 square miles. That's not going to happen. The haul distances are just too long. The other thing is you can't, for the food versus fuel debate is pretty much eliminated starch from the discussion. So we think that DOE and USDA funded projects really need to start looking at smaller scale projects, much more diverse feedstocks, and a much more interdisciplinary approach to how we integrate ethanol into the economy. It's not going to make us energy independent in the short term, but it will really help us demonstrate technical and, more important, economic feasibility of cellulose ethanol conversion. I mean, we can do this. We've been doing it for years, but the economics are what need to be out there. And we can also demonstrate some economic development and carbon reduction and things like that. We've had the chance to look at a couple pretty detailed analysis of a couple different straw to ethanol projects. One in Montana. The best place in Montana to build a pure straw to cellulose ethanol plant is a Fairfield bench. There's about 80,000 acres of irrigated barley up there. Barley straw is really not good for a whole lot. It's very low value as livestock feed or bedding, so there's very low competing value for it. And it's irrigated, so the straw yields are pretty high per acre. And if you took half the straw off the Fairfield bench, left the other half for agronomic reasons, you could make somewhere between 7 and 10 million gallons of ethanol a year, depending on the conversion efficiencies. And that probably represents the largest pure straw to ethanol project you could build in this state. There's there's enough straw. There's 6 million acres of small grains in Montana, so there's enough straw to probably to make ethanol to replace probably 3/4 of the gasoline sold in the state of Montana. But it's all going to be in projects that are this size or smaller. You're not going to build a 100 million gallon a year ethanol plant out of straw in Montana. Probably in the western U.S., the best site we've ever seen for making ethanol from straw is the Willamette Valley in Oregon. There's a couple, maybe 300,000 acres of small grains with high yields and grass seed straw, where they produce all the turf grass seed for the United States in the Willamette Valley. And there's enough straw there within a reasonable haul distance to probably make 20 to maybe 40 million gallons of ethanol a year. And that's still small to DOE, but that's probably the largest single, most economical site in the western U.S. And I think those projects could be really worthy of support if we could get it. But I think the first, and Bob Kearns, and my business partner over here, he and I have been working on this for a long time, and I've looked at a number of different feedstocks, and we think the first thing, these are probably economical now. There's probably economical cellulose to ethanol feedstocks out there now that could be done if we could finance them. But they're going to have a couple characteristics, several important characteristics. One is cellulose that somebody has collected for you for some other reason. Collection cost is not to be underestimated here. And second is it's going to have low lignin or preferably no lignins to reduce your pre-treatment cost. And finally, it's going to, has very low alternative value somewhere. There's not much use for it. It's a waste, or the alternative competing values are really low. And there's a surprising amount of stuff out there that fits this definition. We've looked at a bunch of these things. Sugar beet pulp, left over from making sugar out of sugar beets. That probably is 20 to 40 million gallons worth of ethanol in the western U.S. Pulp and paper mill waste. This is the waste from particularly recycled paper mills, where somebody's taken the lignin off it for you and collected it in a big pile right there. So that makes a good feedstock, but any given paper mill is only going to make maybe 1 or 2 million gallons a year of ethanol, but there's quite a few paper mills. Cotton gin trash. Cotton gin trash is primarily cotton lint that's combed out of cotton, and that's and other, the little bowls and other twigs and stuff, but it's all in one big pile, and they have a hard time getting rid of it. Food processing waste, and this stuff comes up a lot. I, on Friday, had a call from a guy who is working on a project with a big tequila maker in Mexico, and he's making agave syrup, but he wanted to know if you could make ethanol out of the cactus pulp, the agave pulp left over from making tequila. And I said, sure, we'll go down there. How about January for a trip to Guadalajara? And, but that's an example of if you really worked at it, what you could do. But these aren't really even the first projects we've been working on. A couple projects that we have actually been doing a lot of work on in the last couple years. One is, I guess the theme we've had for some of our work is to try to reduce the economies of scale. The DOE is trying to make everything bigger. We're trying to figure out how to make everything smaller so you can fit the technology to available resources. That's the key here. None of those feedstocks I just put up there are going to have a one-size-fits-all model. You're going to have to size whatever you do to how much feedstock is there. So how do you do that? One approach is to be able to integrate all the feedstocks in some region. You can, and that includes integrating starch and cellulose together. And we did a bunch of work to figure out how to do that. And I don't know if this pointer works or not, but yeah, there we go. When you make ethanol out of cellulose, you have a very low concentration ethanol beer. Before you distill it, you get something that's maybe 3% alcohol, so it's very expensive to distill. So we worked out some enzyme technology where you take the cellulose, you delignify it, and you ferment it, and now you've got a low concentration beer. We developed some enzymes for the starch side of this that would let this work. What you do is use the fermentation from the ethanol, from the cellulose, as the makeup water for the starch. So you actually put both starch and cellulose in the same tank, ferment it, and distill it. And now you have now you're distilling something that's 12, 15% alcohol, so the distillation is efficient. And more importantly, it lets you use all of the resources in some area. You go back to the Fairfield bench, now you've got straw for 7 or 8 million gallons of ethanol a year. You've got malt barley that doesn't make malt grade. You've got malt waste. You've got baghouse waste from the elevators. And then you start adding all that up, and you start to get a little bit more of economy of scale. The other thing this process does is really reduce, this is the low capital entry into cellulosic ethanol. One of the major barriers to cellulosic ethanol plants is they're really expensive. And this lets you take an existing corn ethanol plant and use the existing capacity, and if you add front-end equipment to handle straw or corn stover, you can actually use the jet cookers and the existing tankage in a corn-based ethanol plant and get into the cellulose business pretty cheap. For the cost of some front-end handling equipment and an extra tank or two, you can convert an existing corn ethanol plant to about 25% of the output would be from cellulosic ethanol. This morning, I just saw the latest DOE solicitation for integrated biorefinery projects, which was mentioned yesterday, this $480 million program, and it explicitly rejects any project that has anything to do with cornstarch. So this project would not qualify for any DOE funding. And even though we think it's sort of a good idea, but now we're going to do something really completely different. This is our favorite project. We're actually trying to finance and build this now. And it has nothing to do with cellulose, and really isn't an ethanol project. But it's, to us, an example of how you think about integrating ethanol into a local economy, or how you fit this with economic systems. And that's to make fish food. We learned to make we worked with a project with the USDA and had some funding from the National Science Foundation, a bunch of stuff, but with this ARS scientist, and we developed a process to make a 60% protein concentrate out of barley. Start with barley at 14% protein and get a 60% protein out of it, and it is really good fish food. It is replacement for fish meal in aquaculture, and there's a lot of issues with using feeding ground up ocean fish to farm fish. And when you do this, you get a nominal 60% protein product, and the value of this as fish food is 6 times what it is for distillers' grains for cattle food. And so the economics of this is now based on the value of the protein is actually worth more than the ethanol. Ethanol is a byproduct of this process. But it takes you out of the current squeeze that corn ethanol guys are being squeezed by low ethanol prices and high commodity prices. This avoids that because the value of the protein is going to rise and fall with commodity prices, not be based on the ethanol value. But again, it's not going to solve all the problems of the energy independence. If you fed this at a reasonable level to the major aquaculture industries in the world, you'd only make about 40 million gallons of ethanol. But it's 40 million gallons of ethanol that's associated with fixing a really intractable problem of aquaculture, which is serious depletion of ocean fisheries, some pollution issues, and you can employ people in a rural area doing something with barley, which is a good agronomic rotation crop in our wheat systems. So this could make a lot of sense, but again, it's just too small to talk to DOE about. So finally, I'll conclude with a little policy discussion here, since that's what I was supposed to be doing. That, if you get smaller scale projects, you need small scale markets. You need local markets for the ethanol. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to make 5 million gallons of ethanol on the Fairfield bench and try to truck it to California. So we need models where you can have local uses put state fleet vehicles on ethanol or run the county vehicles on ethanol or something like that. You're not going to make America independent of imported oil, but you might make your local county government independent of speculation and oil futures, which is not a bad thing. But the big issue we're all facing is we can't raise capital for any of these kind of projects, not just us, other people. And so there needs to be mechanisms to help raise the capital. We go talk to the bank about making ethanol from fish food and barley, and bankers really don't understand what we're talking about, And probably the purest example of an set of incentives that have no preconceptions about scale or size or feedstock are in Oregon. And they just have a program where the business energy tax credit, if you build an ethanol plant in Oregon, no matter what you use to run it, they give you a sellable tax credit against the value of the capital investment in that plant, which is a huge incentive. I mean, that's what now a venture capitalist will talk to you because you've taken the risk out of it for them. There's also a producer credit where farmers get a tax credit for feedstock. Anything they grow is a feedstock that's for biofuels. And then they have some programs to try to couple these things with USDA programs. So with that, I'm going to stop. I think my time is up, and want to thank you, and this is how you find us. That actually, the picture in the middle is a pilot plant we built in Butte. So if anybody wants to come see a integrated starch and cellulose ethanol plant, one actually exists at a 5,000 gallon fermenter level. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Cliff. Appreciate those perspectives on your experiences here in Montana. Just a bit of a housekeeping point. I mentioned this yesterday, that all the presentations that you see will be posted on the Energy Division's website, which the simplest way to find that is go to the state's webpage and go to the Department of Commerce. The Energy Division's listed there. So you can grab all these, and we'll have these posted in the next day or so. So our next panelist is Bill Carlson with private consultant, Carlson Small Power Consultants. And Bill is located in Redding, California, and his focus, however, is a lot of projects in Montana, and it's basically bioenergy, biomass related, and so he's got a lot of experiences to share with us. So everybody welcome Bill Carlson.
Thank you, Tom. When Cliff was talking about the proper size for a cellulose ethanol plant there, I thought for a minute he was talking about biomass power when he talked about sizing the facility of the resource, which is one of the necessary precursors, but one that a lot of people actually forget should be looked at in this process. I'm a biomass power consultant, work primarily around North America, help people develop biomass power facilities, and come across a large variety of different incentives that people have put in place, typically at the state level, sometimes at the federal level, some of which work fairly well, some of which actually don't work very well at all. And so really my purpose today is to contrast some of those and contrast those that exist in Montana with some of the other states. Cliff already mentioned some of the Oregon programs, which I'll follow up on, just to show you how these need to fit together in order to make an integrated complex work, to make a cost-effective biomass power facility. I'll start for a second with the federal incentives that are out there for biomass power. Basically, until January 1, 2005, there were none. But at that point, what's called open-loop biomass power was added to the federal production tax credit, so that you can now receive a 1 cent per kilowatt hour escalating tax credit for the first 10 years of operation of your facility, provided that that facility is in service by the end of 2013. Now, if you're a person without tax liability, like say a municipal entity or some other type of government entity, you can sort of get a proxy for that by issuing what's called clean renewable energy bonds, or CREBs. And in that case, the bonds are basically interest-free, but the purchaser of the bond then becomes the person who can take the tax credit instead of the entity that was issuing the bonds. They can be paid back over 15 years, and it's supposed to represent a rough equivalency between collecting the production tax credit. Now, this program actually worked fairly well. This program then spawned the development of new biomass power facilities around the country, and that had been dormant for nearly 15 years. There were virtually no plants built for a period of about 15 years until starting in 2005, partially spurred by this credit. But then this credit, basically, when the financial crisis hit, this credit basically stopped working, because most of the entities building these plants do not have the kind of tax liability that they could use all of this tax credit they're thrown off by, say, a sizable facility, needed to bring in a partner. Well, those partners with tax liability evaporated in the financial crisis. Now, Congress recognized that And in the stimulus bill that was passed a few months ago, they changed this to now where you can, instead of this production tax credit, you can take a 30% investment tax credit in the first year. Rather than stretching it out over 10 years, you can pull it forward to the first year of operation. But again, it requires a large tax liability in order to use it. So they said, okay, if you still can't use it on a short-term basis, and you can trade it, take it over to the Treasury, and at startup, you can trade it for a 30% grant from the federal government to support your project. Of course, you can't take both. If you take the grant, then you can't, of course, take the production tax credit. One other program that is fairly recent that has just come about in about a year and a half ago now is that biomass was added to an existing tax credit called the Combined Heat and Power Tax Credit, which was another investment tax credit program that you could collect up to a 10% investment tax credit depending on the size and efficiency of your project. If your project was greater than 15 megawatts, then it was discounted for size, and if it was less than 60% efficient, then it was discounted for efficiency. It's difficult to get, even on an integrated combined heat and power facility with biomass. It's hard to get to 60% overall combined thermal and electrical efficiency because of the moisture content of the fuel. But most of my clients that I've looked at this for typically fall in the range of about a 5 to 7% investment tax credit that they can collect for, say, a sawmill-based combined heat and power facility. The Congress, of course, when they make any legislation in a hurry, it's a relatively sloppy affair. And when all was said and done, basically they wiped this credit off, the ability to use this credit off, because they moved the production tax credit over to this same section called Section 48 from Section 45. And there was some language dangling in Section 48 said if you try to use a Section 45 credit here, you can't use both. And so this credit basically, even though we're trying to get that changed at the moment, you wouldn't count on being able to use both the grant and this credit at the moment. There's also a large number of USDA, DOE grant and loan guarantee programs that are out there. Some have a long history to them, such as the USDA Rural Development grants that are typically in the $250,000 up to $500,000 range that you can get for an individual project. The Department of Energy now has about $800 million that was thrown at them in the stimulus bill to stimulate biomass development. They're still not quite sure, I don't think, what they're going to do with it, but they've talked about substantial loan guarantees there. And the USDA, which could always make loan guarantees up to $10 million, are now telling me that in certain circumstances they go to $25 million for the loan guarantees as part of the stimulus bill. So these can be fairly significant. But let's talk about state incentives for a minute, and I've run across a lot of these in my work. And I'm going to contrast Montana, which is the second column there, with three other states that have thought about this and have tried to put specific incentives in place to incentivize biomass development for reasons that have to do with the state's resources and its economy. So I'm going to contrast it with New Mexico, South Carolina, and Oregon. Okay. Now, basically between these four states, they run the gamut of all the things that you see that are incentives out there. So basically, there's not an incentive that I know of that's not touched probably by one of these four states. We'll start with the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which is the requirement for utilities to have a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources by some date. In Montana, that's 15% by 2015. Okay. New Mexico, it's 20% by 2020. No animal like that in South Carolina, and then the most aggressive is 25% by 2025 in Oregon. Okay, but while those are somewhat similar in nature, the things that make them work or don't work are actually the second thing, the shortfall penalty. What happens to the utility if it doesn't comply? Okay, well in Montana it's a relatively small penalty, $10 per megawatt hour. So if the uplift to get renewable power is more than $10 a megawatt hour, the utility could say, well, let's just forget it, we'll just pay the penalty. Okay. And then it depends on who pays the penalty also, whether the penalty is paid by the ratepayers or whether the penalty is paid by shareholders. Okay. If the state really wants to cause the utilities to move in the direction of renewables, they'll make the shareholders pay the penalty. Okay. Now, in New Mexico, they have to pay the penalty until they pay 2% of all the customers' bills. Okay. And that could be a fairly painful exercise for them. Okay. In Oregon, they have to pay the current value of renewable energy certificates. So there's a risk there to the utility. that if they, those certificates can run upwards of, like in California right now, they're in the $30 range. In Massachusetts, they're over $50 a megawatt hour. So the utility is taking a much greater risk to not comply with this standard. Okay. And then you can also have, biomass can also find its way in as requirements in some of these. In New Mexico, for example, it requires 2% of the total electricity to be from biomass by 2020. Okay. They actually have a defined rate there that says, we've looked at this and these technologies require these sort of revenue streams in order to be successful. And here's the one for biomass. They set it back in 2004 and they set it too low, so it hasn't worked very well, but they at least thought about the concept of how do you incentivize biomass power. So if you move on down to income tax credits, this is where these are state income tax credits now. Montana on the surface looks very good. That 30% should actually be 35. That was just a typo. You can get 35% of the total project cost back as a state income tax credit. Say, for instance, you have a $40 million, 15 megawatt project. Well, that's $15 million in state income tax credits. That's a pretty powerful incentive until you read the fine print that basically says that it must be used only against the income from the project that you created with the investment. In other words, you can't use it in any of your other business enterprises, okay? And a project like these are not heavily cash flow positive, large tax liability projects. I mean, it's the incentives that make these work. And so it basically becomes a tax credit that has much less value to you than it does on its face. And then as Cliff said a minute ago, you can even sell these in some locations. I'll talk about that in a second, but that's not true of the Montana credit. New Mexico has an interesting one. They give you a credit of 1 cent per kilowatt hour for the first 10 years. In other words, they match the federal production tax credit. But if you don't have the tax liability, they'll pay you the rest in cash. Okay. So there's no need to sell it because everybody can use cash. Okay. And so that actually is a fairly novel way to approach this. South Carolina has a 25% investment credit. Theirs runs out. If you don't use it, you can use it over 15 years, and you can use $650,000 maximum per year. But theirs, you can roll it up into a consolidated return. So if you're a large company that wants to, say, convert one of your factories to combined heat and power, you can use it against your overall corporate tax liability, which makes it much more valuable to you than trying to use it on a project-specific basis. And Oregon has the one that Cliff talked about. 50% of the first $20 million, $10 million tax credit taken over 5 years, 10% a year for 5 years up to the 50% level, can be used on a consolidated basis again, just like South Carolina's, but interestingly enough, can be sold for cash. Okay? You have to take a discount because you're getting the cash up front when the project starts up rather than waiting 5 years. But again, it turns it into something that was maybe only moderately interesting to you into a dynamic program that is causing a lot of development of biomass power in Oregon. In terms of property tax reduction, now here Montana has the only one of these 4 state surveys that has a property tax reduction, even though you can often get a property tax reduction for these projects through use of one of the enterprise zone programs that are out there in a lot of states if you're working in an area that's relatively low income. Here, but you can get a 50% reduction for up to 15 years, depending on the circumstances, which is a pretty powerful incentive in Montana. Plus, they just reduced the rate that's assigned to biomass power facilities as well. But you have to choose between that and the income tax credit. Now, all of the projects I've looked at in Montana, because of the inability to use the income tax credit, you are better off to take the property tax reduction. There's a sales tax exemption in New Mexico that saves you maybe 6 to 8% off the capital cost of your facility. State loan program in Oregon that they'll loan you up to $20 million at a relatively low rate and finance 95% of the total cost. South Carolina will actually pay you in cash a penny a kilowatt hour for the first 5 years of production, get you off to a good start. And one of the most innovative ones is Oregon's program to give you fuel use credits for using specific fuels, and primarily the forest fuel that they're trying to get into these plants. They'll give you $10 a green ton credit. And then because I'm running out of time here, I'll skip the public goods charge. But there's also financing incentives that are out there can help. These are getting broader all the time as the financial markets melt down. New market tax credits for building in low-income areas. The tax credit actually goes to the lender rather than the developer. You can now borrow from the Rural Utility Service, which is the division of the USDA. If you're selling to a co-op, that's a new program. Rules haven't even been defined yet. They're not small. You can get 2% interest savings. Will save you about $5 a megawatt hour, and that's often about the difference between you and the utility in trying to negotiate a contract. Then don't underestimate the role of the Public Service Commission in all this, okay? Because they need to take a fairly expansive view of what renewable energy is and not try to cram it into a box that was designed for just fossil energy, okay? They need to do an open and honest calculation of what the utilities' avoided costs were, and most importantly, they need to define who owns the green tags. If you're selling at a brown power derived price, you shouldn't have to do that for green power. Your green power shouldn't have to sell for brown power rates, and they get the green tag. Oregon and New Mexico have carefully defined that you keep it if you sell at those rates. And then lastly, some other ideas that are out there. Some utilities have said, we need biomass power for a specific public policy objective. So we're going to go out and have a solicitation to see what projects, and we'll tell them where we want them, what fuels we want them to burn, because that's why we're doing this. And then we'll see what we get. We'll still get the lowest cost project because it is a request for proposal, and all proposals are open. And here's a few people who have done that. I worked on a project in Arizona that was a result of one of those and is now up successfully operating at the 24 megawatt level. That was a result of one of these RFPs. And then Massachusetts now has an interesting one I just heard about 2 weeks ago. For biomass combined heat and power, they actually say we're going to count both the electricity and the electricity value of the thermal use in terms of calculating the green tags that you have available to sell. And that's a fairly innovative way for them to look at it, which would also be clearly appropriate in Montana. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. That was very informative. I might want to mention, just to add to that, the income tax, the property tax incentive that Bill mentioned was part of the Clean and Green legislation was passed in the 2007 legislative session, which had some sweeping property tax provisions in it. And another portion of that incentive that may be of value to biomass projects are transmission lines that move at least 50% green power, which anything that would come from a biomass plant would qualify for that. Those types of lines got a significant property tax reduction. They went from a 12% permanent rate to a 3% if you're using green power. And then there is that 15-year 50% additional abatement on a potential green transmission line as well. So that's another portion of that particular incentive that could be useful. So our next panelist is Mel Murphy, who's Projects General Manager with Power Plant Management Services. And Mel has 33 years of power generation experience. In his current position, he's responsible for day-to-day management of operating power plant projects owned under the Energy Investors Fund family of funds, including oversight of a third-party O&M provider. And the technologies utilized include natural gas and naphtha-fired combustion turbine and combined cycle facilities and biomass-fired fixed-grate boilers. So let's welcome Mel Murphy.
Thank you. We got to come to the conference this year. We were asked to come, and we were glad to be able to participate. Robin Shropshire, who I work with, has been very active in the state, and so she thought that an industry perspective on people who actually run biomass facilities on a day-to-day basis would be helpful. So. This is the Bernie Forest Products facility. It's located in Bernie, California. It's a 31 megawatt facility. It's a Riley fixed grate stoker. There are actually 2 boilers there. We have a 30-year contract with PG&E. It's a standard offer 4 contract, which is a capacity and an energy payment type contract. We supply process steam to the Shasta Green Mill, and North American Energy Services operates this facility for us. And I think this facility probably is most likely the kind of facility that you would be looking at for something that would be attached to a mill or something you'd use mill refuse. This is an overhead view of that process, and if you look over on the side of the far right-hand side there, you can see that actually the sawmill is there. We've also operated Woodland Biomass Power. This is a 25 megawatt biomass-fired power plant. It's a circulating fluidized bed boiler with natural gas co-firing. It's got a 30-year standard offer 4 contract as well. Two major differences in these two projects. The first project, Bernie, uses forest-derived fuel. Woodland has more of a concentration of urban fuel and agricultural waste. This is how we get the fuel, both at Bernie and at Woodland. It comes to us by truck. We tip the trucks up. At Bernie, we don't actually take the cab up, we just take the trailer up and we dump those out. Each truck contains about 25 green tons of wood. The moisture content of a wood chip is around 40 to 50%, whereas the urban fuel is substantially drier than that. So what's the real cost of a biomass power plant? Well, you start up front with the construction cost. Biomass facility is running right now anywhere from $3,000 to $3,500 a kilowatt hour for construction. That compares to a combined cycle combustion turbine plant, which is running in the neighborhood of $1,000 to $1,250 on a per kW basis. So in economy scales, it's much cheaper to go out and build a combustion turbine than it is to put one of these boilers on the ground. Typically, the way we recover our capital cost is through capacity payments, capacity bonus payments, and those will get recovered by the utility through the rate-based structure, through the Public Utilities Commission or the Public Service Commission. Biomass power is not market power. Yesterday afternoon, I went back and I looked at what market power was on the California ISO. It was trading for $35 a megawatt hour. And they based that on an efficient combined cycle heat rate. Heat rate is how many BTUs it takes to generate 1 kW of energy. And for those plants, it's around 7,000 to 9,000 BTUs per kW. At $3.50 versus where natural gas is trading right now, and that's really what drives the market. That means that producer is going to be paying around $24 to $31.50 to generate that power. So just on a purely fuel cost basis on a combined cycle plant, it makes sense to generate in that environment. But for a biomass plant like Bernie, with a heat rate of 18,900, our fuel cost is $54. Now, the good news is that Bernie doesn't have to compete in that market. We have a 5-year fixed price contract that actually props us up and keeps us from being upside down when it comes to generating power. But those contracts will go away in 2011, so our focus is what do we do whenever those fixed price contracts do expire. So the bottom line to steal from Bruce yesterday, fossil energy is too cheap and will outcompete wood markets in every downturn until the fossil fuel cost structure is increased. Biomass power plants work, but they don't work in a market-based economy, and they're going to need some help. So how do we level the playing field? In California, we do it in a couple different ways. Number one, we talked about the fixed price, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but another program they have is called the California Existing Facilities Renewable Program. And what that does is it pays us an additional amount on top of our energy payment from our fixed price contract up to a specified maximum level and a cap. This is funded through ratepayers. It's a temporary program from 2011. It requires us to produce the power with at least 95% biomass. If you don't use 95% biomass, if you use less than that, if you're combining that with fossil fuels, your credit is reduced. And you have to apply every year, show your financial need, and what your plan is to be self-sufficient by 2011. Fixed price energy contracts, we're actually on our second one. It will actually expire in 2011. We've been told that this is probably in California the last fixed price energy contract, as the market is moving more towards market-based pricing and the MRTU in California. It's likely going to have a big impact on projects like Bernie, and would obviously limit their viability. We also operate naphtha-based, naphtha-fueled combustion turbines in Hawaii, and right now we're on the other side of the equation, where Hawaii has come back and said they want to be energy independent, and by that what they mean is they want to make their own fuel in Hawaii to power their power plants. What that's done is they've come out with a mandate that they will run all renewable projects first and then do an economic dispatch, which has dramatically changed the way that we have been dispatched in Hawaii. We went from being a fairly base-loaded plant, it's a 60 megawatt plant in Hawaii, to a plant that's basically running now down at the contract minimums, and they're using us for swing capacity and using the spinning reserve capacity of the facility. The governor of California just came out and said that he's requiring to have landowners meet 100-foot defensible space requirements to reduce hazardous vegetation and landscaping, and they've authorized CAL FIRE to enter into contracts with biomass facilities and biofuel facilities to take that refuse, if you will, and put it to use. The problem that we run into is, people want to get paid for this kind of stuff, and at the end of the day, the amount of money that they want to get paid for it. We had a little short conversation with the governor yesterday, and he was talking about they wanted to come and pay him $2 to take his diseased trees away, which is really kind of the going rate for a landowner right now. It's about $2, and he indicated to me that he was probably not willing to let the manure go for $2. So I think that's part of the problem. Best policy practices. California uses a California Energy Commission to head all these projects up. They use a one-stop shop called a chief building official. That basically allows you to take the project from scoop to nuts and get it permitted, and use a one-person party to go out there and negotiate all those permits with you. So if you need to get building permits or if you need to get air permits, those all go through the same individual. As far as permitting concerns go, basically what we wanted to talk about here was just the fact that you need to really negotiate your permits very well and make sure that you have all the things you need to know up front. The other thing is, as ash becomes more and more of a commodity, you want to maintain some flexibility in what you can do with your ash. There's one other, I think I skipped over one slide. So the other big issue here is what does biomass fuel really cost? What we were told whenever our prices were going up on biomass fuel is that it's heavily influenced by the price of diesel. Then whenever the price of diesel went down, we didn't see any depression of those prices, and we were a little confused as whether or not it was really heavily influenced that much by the price of diesel whenever the price of diesel went in the tank. And I think it's probably, it's unfortunate, but I mean, everybody is enthusiastic about raising prices, but no one's really all that crazy about decreasing them. We've also seen a decrease in logging activity, and that's also had an impact on the availability of the sawmill waste that we've gotten at our Bernie facilities. The price of fuel continues to escalate at 3 to 4% per year, and our fixed price contracts only escalate at 1% per year. Competing markets for the biomass fuel has also reduced the quality and the quantity of the fuel. And if you're looking at the urban fuel in particular, there are a lot of different projects out there where they're taking the high quality fuel from the waste areas and are making things like colored mulch with that, which people are now putting in their gardens, which is nice. And they can make about 7 times what they can make by selling it to us. On the horizon, biofuels using woody biomass as a feedstock is another big issue for us. Is that as time goes on, you know, that resource needs to be there for us, and we think that that will also put price pressure on us as well. And when you talk biomass, fuel is really the big risk for your projects. So, apologize for skipping over that, but you know, in a nutshell, fuel price is really the game for us. If we can keep our fuel price under control, when we compete with other fossil fuel facilities, the fuel price on an MMBTU basis is competitive, but the heat rate really takes us out of the game. So that's why if you're really looking to build biomass facilities in your state, you're going to have to find a way to help those folks be competitive and find good incentives and adders to their energy prices so that they can be viable on a long-term basis. Thanks a lot, and appreciate the ability to participate.
Thanks, Mel. I think Mel's discussion really kind of outlined sort of the issue of that we struggle with renewables, and what Bruce Lipke mentioned yesterday about the competition with fossil fuels, that we won't compete with renewables with fossil fuels until such time as the real cost of producing energy from fossil fuels is recognized. And of course, we're moving toward things like cap and trade, and I think things are going to be you know, some of that playing field could be leveled. And you heard what Richard Opper said yesterday, that, you know, 30 years ago when we went through the first oil embargo, and we started to get serious about weaning ourselves from things like foreign oil from unfriendly places. But when the cheap oil came back, we kind of got back to that addiction, and so we do have to deal with these challenges, and hopefully things will be changing as we move forward. So our last panelist is with McKinstry Company. That's David Naccarato. David is the business development manager for McKinstry's Boise branch. An Idaho native, he has been responsible for over $150 million in energy conservation, renewable energy, and infrastructure development projects in Idaho, Montana, eastern Montana, and eastern Oregon. And he brings a wealth of experience to share with us today, so let's welcome David.
Well, thanks for having me. You know, this is a big topic, and it's always a challenge to kind of slice out. You know, what I would like to focus on is what we're experiencing and working with municipalities and rural economies. I mean, there are 3 primary issues that all communities, particularly rural or forest-based communities, are struggling with. It's issues around energy, economic development, and infrastructure. These are the challenges. Your typical municipal challenges are, how do we own our energy future, and how do we drive our economic development and the loss of the traditional jobs, and then what do we do about infrastructure? I mean, what happens across the board, and I don't think it matters whether you're in Oregon or Idaho or Montana, is that patrons, constituents are saying, we're done, we're being taxed too much, we don't want to raise our property taxes, and there's always this continual adversarial relationship between the public municipalities' needs and the needs of the private folks. And I think it was from that perspective that we began to look at a program that I call Community Development Initiative. How can forest-based communities look at their local renewable resource, which is biomass? It's not solar, it's not wind. Yes, we have wind resources in Montana and Idaho and Washington, Oregon, but for instance, in Idaho, where the greatest wind resources are, there is no transmission lines. And, but in many cases, biomass is the available renewable resource. And what's driving that interest, I think, at the federal level is issues around climate change. Whether or not you think that's credible or viable or even accurate, we often have to tell people, I'm not going to get into the issues of debating the science, but if the nation is going to deal with climate change initiatives, they have to look at biomass as a relevant renewable resource in the western United States. So when we look at developing these biomass plants, and I speak, McKinstry is a design-build firm. What we do is we take a concept through design, through construction, and oftentimes into the ongoing operation of the project. We have to own every facet of it. And what happens in a lot of the rural communities is they say, the idea is we want to attract these merchant plants to come in, build the biomass facility, provide jobs, and we'll be happy. The problem with that model is when you do a purely private investment, the return on investment criteria is so steep that in most cases your municipality is not going to be in the list. We look for those ideal scenarios that Bill and the other folks have talked about, which meets the return on investment protocols. But a municipality has one thing that they often overlook, and that is longevity. Because really money in financing is really two things. You either have cash up front or you have good, long-standing dependability, or what we call credit, which most municipalities have, and then they have longevity. A municipality can look at a 20-year note, an industrial revenue bond. And once you began to look at these projects, not in terms of a 7-year paying back an investment, but then 10, 15, and 20-year, all of a sudden, in a lot of cases, these projects, at least from a financial perspective, make sense. So when I look at policy, we go into these communities, we say, okay, look, we have the resources, and I'll speak about Idaho for a moment. The local PUC, Idaho's PUC has said, we get non-fossil fuel purchase agreements. They're now at $91 a megawatt. Folks, at $91 a megawatt hour, you can make these biomass projects pay. So much so that whereas in the old days, if you didn't have a use for the steam, if you couldn't sell the steam, you got checked off. Adams County was an example. They had the resource actually, but they had no real use for steam. There were no industries that could use that. Today, we don't even worry about that. We put in a condensing system, we get our $91 a megawatt hour, and it pays. And it actually pays quite well because municipalities want principally a couple things. They don't want to go in a year-to-year debt situation. They want to know that the revenue from a project meets their debt obligation. They want to create jobs, and they want it to be sustainable. So this is where we get into the policy issue that's really troubling. When we go out to the financial markets, and everyone talks about it, and by the way, I love the business energy tax credits that Oregon have and all the federal programs, but the bottom line is those make things more attractive, but you still have to go out and get money. Someone has to lend you capital to finance these projects, and someone must own that debt. And over a particular amount of time, that debt must be paid back. So the good news is when you go into these financing firms and you talk about industrial revenue bonds and you say, look, the year-to-year revenue streams from this 10 megawatt biomass plant meet the criteria and we have a 20-year power purchase agreement to back it up, it's great. It makes sense now. The problem is that they look at it and they say the people who are buying these bonds, and when I say industrial revenue bonds, we have even gotten away from general obligation bonds. We found that most municipalities, the local taxpayers do not want to be at any risk whatsoever for the failure of a plant. So you're never going to get it passed in a municipality that the taxpayers will back this up. So an industrial revenue bond, the project is floated on its own financial strength. The issue is, however, the people buying those bonds need to see that the fuel supply is equally guaranteed. And the only way to do that is that if the people that are delivering you fuel are willing to provide a contract for the term of the debt service. And that can only be done through multi-year stewardship contracts with access to fuel into our federal lands. You see, anymore I don't really worry about the PUC issues because the purchase agreements are getting up to speed. And it's actually, frankly, a fairly easy political issue on a state-per-state basis to increase those. The issue is around the federal policy. The stewardship contracts that we look at are often done in a bubble. They don't make any sense. So imagine a project like this. You go into a local forest-based community, and I'll use Shoshone County as an example because we're actually developing a project there. We need about 100,000 tons of fuel a year, give or take. So what we're proposing is a stewardship contract that is properly sized so that in a cyclic remediation through a healthy forest process, it is set up to deliver biofuel for that generation plant. Once you create that linkage between the two, you can then begin to site these projects throughout the western United States. But without the federal policy that allows that, it makes it very difficult. There are pockets where it can be done. You find these pockets, and we're all in the same business to find those little niches where we can gather enough fuel and run the numbers and go, bingo, it works. The problem is that's not enough to make a meaningful impact. And the interesting thing is chicken and the egg, where the stewardship policy says, well, how do we deliver fuel? We need an economic base for that. But if you can go to this and say, look, we'll provide you a 20-year fuel purchase guarantee, because that's what's tied to the power purchase plan, it's very easy for industry to do what we do. We're all really good at developing these projects. What's having to be caught up is the political will at a state and a federal level to begin to look at their stewardship projects around a remediation of healthy forests to deliver small diameter, by small diameter typically, 20 or 21 inch or smaller for a dry forest, to deliver this waste stream to these biomass plants. And they provide the economic anchor for what is then a refined wood products industry, not around traditional logging or home building, but to the other products that can come out of that. That's the single biggest challenge we have. The good news is we now have an administration whose energy policy is driven primarily from climate change. And what we still are not doing a very good job is the western states linking up the need to do healthy forest remediation as a primary component to national climate change policy. Our congressmen don't get it, which is why the latest Waxman bill, I mean, they just put in a definition of biomass that it's a renewable energy unless it comes from a federal land, which is really silly if you think about it, because solar is a renewable energy. The fact that those rays might fall in Yellowstone Park doesn't make it less renewable. Now, whether or not you harvest that energy is a policy issue. So these are the things we're working out. When we met with these people, we had our congressional constituents talk to them. It's not that they had any insidious backing of this, they just didn't know any better. Because biomass isn't sexy. It's not sexy. It's not sexy like wind. It's not sexy like solar, but it just happens to be humankind's first fuel. In fact, a few years ago, I was on a plane and ran into an old buddy of mine that we used to work together in the food processing industry years ago. He said, hey, what are you doing now? I said, I'm in energy. And he goes, oh, great. I said, yeah, it's really cutting edge stuff. And he said, well, what is it? Is it cold fusion or nuclear power or thin film solar? I said, no, wood. And he looks at me, he goes, wood? Yeah, wood. There was a reason that it's really, in a lot of ways, our primary renewable resource. Most congressmen don't even understand that if in the entire national energy portfolio, biomass energy produces somewhere between 7 and 10% of our total electric production, depending on what you read. I mean, some say 6, some say 10. Wall Street Journal pegged it at 10, which is more than double all of the other renewable energies combined. And yet I submit to you that it gets probably less press than any of the other ones. And that's frankly our fault in a lot of ways. So when we look at these projects, I don't worry about the technical side of it. Here's the good news. Technically, you can burn wood. It creates heat, you can generate steam, and you can generate electricity. So we can put that aside. From a contractual process, most states now have a methodology to contractually do these. Economically, it makes sense now, but politically the will has to start at a local municipal level. I believe what can drive this policy change is that municipalities need to quit worrying and hoping that we as McKinstry or any other company will swoop in, build a biomass plant, and provide 25 jobs for folks, because it's not going to happen. If they were going to build it, they'd already be there. municipalities have to take responsibility for their own projects through public-private partnerships where they have a direct, long-term vested stake in these projects. Because when you do that, it opens the door for long-term municipal energy bonds or municipal industrial bonds. And you can have a long-term stake in the sustainability of these projects. And this is where it begins, I believe, my opinion only, although I think I'm right sometimes. My wife would never say I am. So anyway, I mean, that's it in a nutshell, and that's how we view these projects. And the good news is there's been an increasing interest. The bad news is there's still, for every one community that has the political will to see it through, there's 4 more that just don't. They just wring their hands and, oh, we can't get the buy. But, you know, I think if municipalities begin to step up, something else I'll put out there, you know, a lot of the glamour is in these cogen plants, and we love them. We love combined cycle projects. But at the same time, I also challenge each community that if your local school or your local hospital wants to put in a simple biomass boiler to heat that community public building, they need to fund that. And oftentimes the only way to do that is to pass a bond. So communities need to support those public ventures. And it is frustrating for me when I see a lot of school districts say, hey, we want to heat our schools with a biomass boiler. And then they go to run a bond and the local patrons say, oh, we're not going to support that. I mean, think about it. So it's not only just the demand side, not just the supply side, power generation, creation of jobs, revenue generation for municipalities. It's the conservation side. You burn wood because it's still, even at $40 a ton, it's a fifth of what fuel oil is to heat those public buildings. It's a fifth of what propane is. We tell people in Salmon, if you use wood, you're reducing your dependency on imported power. Not just foreign, but from other states. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts and ideas, and hope that was...
Thank you very much, David. That was, I think, really, in a lot of ways, summed up one of the reasons why we're having this workshop is to get at some of these type of policy issues that that hopefully we're going to really flesh this out in our workshop or our breakouts later today. And with that, we have some time for Q&A here, and so we've got all 4 of these great presenters available. So I'll just open it up to the floor now. Anybody have a specific question for any of our 4 panelists that they'd like to ask? Dave.
Mel, you showed the price of natural gas and compared to the wood. How did that look last year when natural gas was $12 or $13 a decatherm?
Did everybody hear that question? Okay.
It obviously skews the mix. Okay, if you've got a heat rate that's, you know, a third of a combined cycle heat rate, or the combined cycle heat rate's a third of, it's just going to track, because I mean that's just the way it works. But understand too is that that's just a fuel cost. The other thing that combined cycle facilities have going for them is they don't create byproducts. They don't have to handle the material as much, so their labor cost is lower. So there are a lot of other things that go into the variable cost, I'd call, that make them sometimes more attractive. So, you know, at $12, it's probably pretty close. You know, certainly if you look at the SRAC costs last summer in California, you know, that were, you know, $80, $90, we can certainly compete in those markets. But I think the other thing you have to do too is the energy cost alone won't get the plant built. You've got to have the capacity payment there in order to make that work, and the capacity payment is just simply an adder to that energy cost at the end of the day.
David.
So you said your fixed price contract ends 2011. Isn't that when the AB 32 cap and trade in California kicks in? How do you see that mix interacting?
I don't see AB 32 necessarily impacting that I think those were two separate functions. This last fixed price contract came out of negotiations between the independent energy producers in California and PG&E to get that second fixed price contract. California right now is going to the MRTU, and for all intents and purposes, they'd like for the MRTU to take the place of short run avoided cost, or what we call SRAC. I think that there may be some impact, but you have to also consider too that AB 32, which we're just kind of in the initial throes of right now. Right now, there's no real financial incentive that's given to a biomass facility through AB 32. We're just collecting data right now. If we have a facility in Crockett, California, and I think they're looking at maybe $30,000 in fees, which is that won't offset that difference at all for a plant like Crockett as compared to a plant like Bernie. So 30 grand on an annual basis really won't change things.
You talked about the permitting process in California. Would one of you mention or talk about how the Montana permitting process fares in relationship to other states?
I can't answer that.
Bill, you probably.
Well, actually, to be quite honest, none of the projects in Montana, biomass power, have advanced to the point where that's much of an issue. I don't expect it to be, I've had discussions with the DEQ about it, I don't expect it to be a showstopper, so to speak. But there's clearly not the consolidation that there could be in terms of just having one point of contact for a facility like that to shepherd you through the process.
And the one project we're working on, again, I agree with Bill, we're not seeing the permitting process is what we call an iceberg that would impede the project. That's not where the issues are.
Yes, in the back.
This is for Mel. How far are you getting your biomass from to your facility? What's the distance?
I think we're going as far as maybe 150 miles, but I think if you get much beyond that, the transportation cost eats you up. What we talked about earlier is the cost of this commodity is really low. In some cases, it's just free. Come and get it. But the problem is that you're paying a lot of money to process this fuel and to transport it to your facility.
And on the fuel costs, I mean, I think what we're seeing, a lot of this fuel costs up and down is a reflection of the way it's set up today, where it's on a year-to-year basis. What we're finding in those situations where we can do multi-year fuel purchase contracts, where you can, whether it's 7 or 10 years, in a lot of cases we have fixed rate of fuel delivery over a 10-year period, because folks that are delivering it can amortize their equipment costs. And again, I think it gets back to this ability to have access to the fuel in its raw source in the federal lands. If you're issuing a 7 or 10-year fuel contract, you as the buyer of that can not only negotiate lower costs, but give those providers what they're looking for, and that is that long-term dependability. And I think that's what's lacking in the market today. It's seen as a year-to-year commodity or what's available, and I think that makes it very difficult to peg projects.
And to build on to that, I don't have any contracts in that range. I mean, the longest contracts I have are 2-year contracts. And I just can't find anybody that's willing to sign up for a 7-year deal because they're afraid they're going to leave too much money on the table if they sign up for a long-term contract. And so, we have contracts that range from 90 days to 2 years. And, I mean, you're largely paying what the market will bear.
Probably have time for one more question if anybody has one. Dick.
Just recently there was a newspaper article about a project in northern Arizona, the Flagstaff, Winslow, Williamson area, 4 national forests, and it talked about a 20-year stewardship commitment, something like 15,000 acres to be treated a year. That's the sort of linkage of healthy forest initiative with federal policies you're talking about. If I understand that right, what do we have to do in this part of the country to make progress toward that?
Dave?
No, I'm just kidding. I'll take that one on first. That, I read the same announcement, and I got it from 4 or 5 different people, and to be quite honest, that agreement is really, it's going to be difficult for the Forest Service to carry out with the requirements that they have. All these groups could come together and say that, but there's somebody that's not at the table that's not in favor of that. You can bank on that. But that agreement was years in the making, absolutely years in the making. And it really, it's a question of the local people can come together and do exactly that. It's happened many times in the West, where local groups have recognized the problem, they're close enough to the issue to understand it, and they can strike agreement that this is what we should do. The problem is when outside groups that are not local in nature, that are headquartered in San Francisco or Washington, D.C., say, we don't recognize that there's any legitimate commercial uses for the public lands. That's the issue we have to get past. And we've left them too many opportunities, too many avenues to disrupt this local process. And that, quite honestly, can't be solved by the Forest Service. That can only be solved by Congress. And they have to interrupt some of these avenues that they have where, I guess that today it's a 44-cent stamp, but for the price of a 44-cent stamp, you can disrupt any legitimate process like this. That we went through this in California, what's called the Quincy Library Group, which was a giant collaborative effort, came up with what I would call nearly perfect solutions to some of the forest health issues. And despite a vote in Congress with only one dissenting vote on going forward with this, they've still been able to disrupt it to the point where virtually nothing has been accomplished under that initiative. That's probably more than you wanted.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really needs to be top down, but I do think what we're missing today is that what drives a lot of the advocacy groups is the climate change issue. And so what we have to do is create the linkage between healthy forest remediation and climate change. And I think we're just now getting into that. I mean, as odd as it sounds, oftentimes it's how you wrap something that makes it more politically expedient. The administration supports it. But, you know, that's, I think now with the current administration is our best opportunity to drive a top-down change because of the climate change. But it's a challenge. I mean, I meet with groups all the time that think the whole climate change issue is a left-wing liberal plot. And, you know, and I'm going, folks, whatever you think about it, it is probably our single best political tool to make biomass and healthy forest remediation a reality. So
The other thing I would add is that we work, our fuel buyer is a California certified forester. He works very closely with CFA, and we support the CFA and are members of that. We try to do that. We lose wood every year that we have under contract because of interveners, and that forces us to go out and have to find other sources of fuel. So, you know, it's an ongoing problem.
One more question.
One important consideration that we haven't heard a lot about today or over this couple of days, and I think for this group I have this question specifically to you. When these things are utilized for projects that aren't permitted, aren't regulated, that are small enough, they fall through regulatory requirements, there needs to be consideration for bringing wood and additional pollution, not outside of the greenhouse gas or climate change impacts. The bottom line really does need to consider the incorporation of these types of or high advanced air pollution controls when you're bringing these types of units into places with susceptible populations, schools, hospitals, things like that. Is that, I mean, as you guys in the industry look at these things, is that a primary consideration that you have? These things are not regulated to the extent that these large utility scope projects are, but they are certainly resulting in impact.
Well, we all have air permits, okay, and we're all required to at the time the plant's built, you're required to build that facility with best available control technologies, right? So we do have opacity monitors and NOx monitors and SOx monitors and CO monitors. So we are monitoring the emissions on an ongoing basis from all the power plants that we operate, whether it's a biomass facility or if it's a combined cycle facility.
Yeah, they're very, very, very clean. That's not been an issue. The other thing that I think from a policy perspective you need to keep in mind is in most states the current DEQ policies don't take into effect that when you burn biomass efficiently, and these are extremely clean plants, you're preventing that same wood waste from what is typically burned openly, whether it's in catastrophic fires, whether it's in open slash piles. And so in every case, you actually are contributing significantly to a net reduction in airborne emissions, be it particulate or otherwise, not to mention the additional carbon reduction benefits you get. And that's why I think they're so attractive to look at from that perspective.
Can I just add something? I think Eric's question was related to not the permanent sources, because we know, and in Montana they are required to have best available control. You know, we're talking about encouraging municipalities to put them in hospitals and schools. There can be issues with related, putting small particulate near really susceptible populations. And honestly, I would be concerned about putting one in my kids' school.
It's largely a perception. When people look at burning wood, they think of the local wood stove or fireplace. Consider for a second that for a long time, the average DEQ wanted 2.5 pounds of particulates per million BTU or less. Now they're talking 1.5. These systems are generating 0.005. They are just, so we're just the amount, and what you get is basically a steam plume. It's just that people equate wood with being burnt dirty, and that's a lot of, frankly, general misconception about how clean these projects are. Consider the fact that in many rural communities, what's the alternative? Propane, fuel oil, because in a lot of cases they don't even have natural gas. So you're producing a project that has emissions comparable to what a natural gas-fired boiler would be, but in most cases you're displacing either propane or fuel oil. Many times are older systems. So again, you're actually going from one level of emissions and pollutions down to a much cleaner source. It's a perception thing. And if you look at the emissions data from these projects, they're extremely clean. I mean, if anything, you would want to be incented to put more of them in. Because again, unlike the propane burners, in addition, you're not only getting the increased efficiency of the system, you're actually now burning it efficiently instead of how it's being burnt currently. So
if we could thank this panel, I want to